Hi, this is Jurgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis Vlog. This episode is about freedom of speech, political correctness, victimhood culture, and how I, after 23 years of seeing clients full time, have become convinced that a culture that both legally and culturally endorses freedom of speech is essential for psychological health and psychological maturity, and for a peaceful society full of adults who have the capacity for perspective taking, intelligence, compassion, and vice versa. How victimhood culture and political correctness and the current erosion of freedom of speech that we're seeing both legally and culturally is stunting psychological growth and maturity and turning us into adult versions of children, and how this also increases rates of depression, suicide, anxiety, and what people erroneously call mental illness, which is essentially just a way of talking about unnecessary psychological suffering. So here's the case. When it comes to dealing with conflict, we essentially have two choices. We can attempt to persuade each other, use words, language, persuasions, deal with one another on a voluntary basis, or we can attempt to use violence, essentially strangle each other to sort out our differences. If you take away freedom of speech, you leave violence and state-sanctioned violence as the only alternatives. That's a bad thing. Look at what differentiates a relatively free society from a dictatorship. Of course, this isn't a perfect distinction, but it's pretty good. A distinction is that in a relatively free society, physical assaults, theft, violence, rape, muggings, murder, fraud, these sorts of actions against an actual victim are a crime, but you don't have, or you're not supposed to have, thought crimes. Your ideas, your meaning making, your values, your verbal utterances are not supposed to be crimes. If you look at any dictatorship, you will see that this distinction is non-existent. It's blurred. Having the wrong opinion, challenging the leaders that be, or the dominant religious ideas, is tantamount to raping, punching, mugging, doing fraud. The distinction between words and violence is not really there. That's, for all practical purposes, the distinction between a dictatorship, an authoritarian regime, and a relatively free society. A society that's relatively free both socially and economically. So these days, as freedom of speech is taking a big hit both legally and culturally, we are moving towards more authoritarian societies. We are moving in the direction of dictatorships. Consider democracy. And I'm not really a fan of democracy per se, and we can discuss whether we really have democracies. I would argue that we don't. Meaning, if you have a political system where you have various masters and rulers who have different solutions for, if you vote for us, we're going to take money from these folks and give them to you, and you have other political parties who essentially do the same with a different twist, this is like a multiple choice thing. Whereas I would argue that if you really were to have a democracy, the population itself would have to be involved in generating the actual ideas and solutions that they vote for. So, for example, for us regular people, we essentially have no say. So I would argue that we don't really live in democracies. But if we make the argument that we kind of do, consider what a democracy requires psychologically of its participants. It requires 49% of the population, if they lose, to submit to the will of the other 51%. That's a lot to ask. That is a lot to ask. Now, if you're going to ask that and simultaneously prohibit or bar people from actually voicing their opinions, presenting their case, challenging ideas, that's asking way too much in anything that's supposed to resemble a free society. Now, let's get back to psychological health, psychological maturity. Consider the psychological demands of being an adult in a modern society. A few generations ago, being an adult was defined by your culture, meaning if you showed up at the factory on time, if you did your work tasks as defined by proper authority, or if you raised your kids or enacted the role as a spouse as defined by the religion or the state, that was enough in a more traditional society to be considered an adult. It's not really enough in a modern society. In a modern society, being responsible is not about following protocol and doing what you're told. It's about being able to step back from that cultural surround and to decide for yourself what type of father or mother to be. To decide for yourself, what type of relationship you want to be part of. Or to decide for yourself what the right thing is. It requires a whole different level of psychological autonomy. So, for example, in a democracy, that requires a population that's able to step back from their own family values, their own religious upbringing, to step back from the culture at large, and to have your own perspective, your own inner judgment about these things. Now, how could you ever do that if any idea is sacred? If you can't challenge, discuss, debate, or question any idea, you will not develop the psychological maturity that it takes to be part of a modern democracy. If you take another look at what's required to live peacefully as part of an adult relationship, it requires you to have the ability to have a relationship to your relationships, meaning you can't be made up by your relationships. So, for example, I remember many years ago I worked with a young Muslim woman who had a Norwegian boyfriend and simultaneously had parents who would never accept that she had an infidel as a boyfriend. And she described this to me as feeling as if she was teared in two, right? Because her identity was made up by her relationships. Who she thought significant others, or what she thought significant others expected her to be, largely made up her own sense of self. If this is where you operate, you don't have relationships. You are your relationships. And in that sense, you'll have a tendency psychologically to become under-responsible and over-responsible simultaneously. You'll have a tendency to play victim, to outsource the source of your own emotions onto other people, as in, he makes me happy, she makes me feel sad. You'll simultaneously have a tendency to be over-responsible in terms of, well, in that case, I can make other people happy or sad. So I am responsible for other people's inner life. This results in poor boundaries. So, for example, one reason why a lot of therapists aren't very effective is that they haven't developed that capacity for self-authorship. They don't have proper healthy boundaries. They're simultaneously over-responsible and under-responsible in relationship to their clients. So being an adult requires you to be able to have a relationship to your relationships. That actually encourages greater intimacy, because what you need to then do is that you need to not view other people as sources of approval. You need to not view other people as tools or sources of approval or respect. You need to grant other people their own autonomy, their own inner life that's relatively independent of yours. Now, we can talk about interdependency all day, but we have to get to psychological autonomy first before we can even talk about interdependency as anything meaningful, right? Now, the way freedom of speech relates to this is, if you're going to be able to have a relationship to your relationships, if you're going to be able to have healthy boundaries, if you're going to be able to step back from your culture and have your own inner authority, if you're going to be able to discover that values and meaning aren't inherent in topics and people and subjects, but we largely create these values, for you to be able to develop these perspective-taking capacities, you have to be willing and able to challenge any idea. Any idea. Including ideas that other people have identified with. Including ideas that other people view as sacred. And ideas who other people get furious and offended if you even dare to challenge the validity of. So the thing with freedom of speech too is that you need the ability to talk about your ideas to have the chance to understand your own ideas. Because if you're not involved in debates, discussions, if you don't have people in your life who challenge your ideas, that leads to a poverty in terms of understanding your own position. Meaning, to be able to really understand your own position, you need to debate it, you need to discuss it, you need to see how it relates to other perspectives, right? So if we prohibit, either legally or culturally, this notion of challenging ideas, if people get the idea that they have the right to not hear things that challenge their religious beliefs or their identity, they're going to get more stupid, because they're not going to develop the capacity to really understand their own perspective. That's going to make it more likely that you get emotional knee-jerk responses and snowflake tendencies. Whenever one hears something one doesn't like, one will be more likely to view it as a personal attack versus viewing it as, okay, this is how someone else sees the world. So you also, if we no longer have freedom of speech, you rob other people the right to actually hear what you think. Listen, if you want a relatively free society, you need a high level of trust. Now, how can you have a high level of trust if everyone kind of senses that no one really speaks their mind anymore? Because they're so terrified of being socially ostracized, or they're so terrified of offending anyone. So you get this increased disparity between what people say in public and what people really think. Now, if people begin to sense that that's the case, there goes trust. If trust goes, you don't have much else. So these are extremely important things to consider, right? One task that I very often give my clients, if they have issues with anger or they struggle with black and white thinking, they're lost in their perspective, a task I very often give them is to publicly argue for the opposite position. So let's say that they're against gay marriage, for example, or they're for gay marriage. It doesn't really matter. I'll have them go out in public and argue for the opposite position. Now, for a lot of my clients, this sounds strange. They go, well, why would I ever do that? I'll say, well, because if you can argue for the opposite position well enough that other people actually believe that you believe what you're saying, or your enemies, so to speak, accept you as one of their own, to be able to do that, you really have to understand the other position. And that will give you an increased ability to understand your own original position. Meaning, you'll be a better persuader. You'll be better able to argue for your own position if you understand how the enemy, in quotation marks, thinks. That's a good thing. B, if you really test your own position, then counter arguments may end up modifying your own original position or even altering it completely. In that case, you've also learned something. And other people too have the chance of learning something. This is actually good. So even though a lot of people have thought that, man, this is a ridiculous task, what is he asking me? Most of the clients who do this, actually acknowledge it to be a very useful task after the fact. Another very useful task to give people, if they have someone in their life that they quarrel with or that they really dislike or really hate, for their opinions, is to have them do a writing task where they have to assume that the other person is the hero in the story. So if you end up writing, well, that person has no empathy and is a sociopath and a piece of shit, then you're kind of stuck in your own position. But you have to argue for the fact that that person is the hero in the story. And to be the hero in the story, how must that person view things? And what qualities and motives and characteristics will they likely project onto you for that to reinforce them as the hero in the story? The reason why I give people these sorts of tasks is that it increases their perspective-taking capacities, which is psychologically a big part of being resilient, of being anti-fragile, and quite simply, frankly, to be able to be rational and to be an adult. So a culture of freedom of speech supports and encourages and makes it more likely that people will mature psychologically, develop those capacities for self-authorship, develop perspective-taking capacities. It'll make them more intelligent, wiser, and more compassionate. Let me tell you who's not compassionate. People who view themselves as victims. People who view themselves as victims get extremely egocentric. They view the world in terms of victim, oppressor, and they have no compassion for whoever challenges their mythology of being the victim, or whoever they have put in that other category. So if you want to live among people who are more compassionate and have more perspective-taking capacities and have more capacity for rationality, victimhood is the last thing that you want to encourage. Nothing, barring extreme poverty, war, these sorts of things, incurable illness, nothing in a modern society makes people more miserable than an identity of being a victim. Now, I'm not saying that people aren't somehow victimized, but I'm talking about the identity of being a victim. Outsourcing your own inner emotional life as being caused by people and events outside of yourself. Nothing makes people more miserable than that. Now, tragically, modern psychologists, not all of them, but quite a few of them, and especially psychiatrists, are doing what they can to medicalize our internal lives and to get people to view themselves as victims, view themselves as sufferers of various mental illnesses and chemical imbalances. Now, to be cynical, there's a big reason why they're doing this, because it gives them more power. You see, the more adults who are willing to play the victim role and play the sick role, the more power psychiatrists will have, the more influence they will have, the more they will get to run society on their own whims. And the more you will have to pay for it and support it through your tax dollars. Of course, if you ever object to this, you're a psychopath without empathy, right? Who doesn't understand human suffering, you know? So speaking the truth about these sorts of things is in many ways a sort of offense. Now, tragically, quite a few psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, instead of rallying up for freedom of speech, that culture, many of them are taking the politically correct opposite case. So, for example, Lisa Feldman Barrett is a horrible example of this. She's written quite a good book called How Emotions Are Made. I'm going to quote from an excellent book here called The Coddling of the American Mind, written by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. And they just verbalize it so well that I want to give credit where credit is due. So let's see here. In a widely circulated essay in the New York Times in July 2017, the argument that words can be violence was made by Lisa Feldman Barrett, a well-respected professor of psychology and emotion researcher at Northeastern University. Barrett offered this syllogism: if words can cause stress, and if prolonged stress can cause physical harm, then it seems that speech, at least certain types of speech, can be a form of violence. Now notice here, blurring the distinction between thought crimes and actual assaults, right? This is a step in the direction of a dictatorship. Now, going back to Lukianov and Haidt's book, we responded in an essay in The Atlantic in which we noted that it is a logical error to accept the claim that harm, even physical harm, is the same as violence. Barrett's syllogism takes the form that if A can cause B and B can cause C, then A can cause C. Therefore, if words can cause stress and stress can cause harm, then words can cause harm. But that does not establish that words are violence. It only establishes that words can result in harm, even physical harm, which we don't doubt. To see the difference, just rerun the syllogism by swapping in breaking up with your girlfriend or giving students a lot of homework. Both of these provoke stress in someone else, including elevated levels of cortisol, and stress can cause harm, and both can cause harm. That does not mean that they are violent acts. Now, what Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, I think, miss a little bit here is, of course, that words themselves don't cause stress. It's our interpretation of the words that cause stress. It's our own thoughts. It's not the words themselves. It's the meaning that we attribute to it. So, for example, in a recent great book called The Rise of Victimhood Culture, they also, Jason Manning and Bradley Campbell also write about Lisa Feldman Barrett. and how she wants to ban speakers such as Milo Yiannopoulos, the gay conservative Trump supporter, from speaking at universities and in the media because she views his rhetoric as a form of violence against brain cells. But the problem is, I really enjoy his speeches. I agree with many of his arguments. That's not a violation of me, but she wants me to not have the right to hear opinions that she finds distasteful, right? So whether you get freedom of speech, the litmus test to see if you get freedom of speech is, are you willing to grant freedom of speech to your enemies, to people who have opinions you hate or find contemptful? If you're not, you don't get freedom of speech. And this is the problem with most people. They want freedom of speech for themselves, but they would like the government to restrict speech that they don't like or approve of. But it's not the speech that most people approve of that requires the protection of free speech. It's what a lot of people find offensive and hateful. It's never been smart, at least not in the short term, to challenge the sacred ideas of any society, but it's the only way any society can really move forwards. Now consider this. In this era of hate speech laws and political correctness, attempting to ban your right to hate is as oppressive as attempting to control who you can love. It's just as oppressive. Now, it's not only left-wing psychologists, and they're all pretty much left-wing, who pose a huge challenge in psychiatry, and radical leftists who pose an enormous challenge towards freedom of speech. Is our own lack of historical understanding. And Islam is an enormous threat to freedom of speech. If you look at the hate speech laws that members of the United Nations are compelled to impose on its members, the first country who pioneered this in the United Nations system in the early 50s was Stalin's Soviet Union. Why do you think they did that? To protect the so-called tender-hearted? No, to be able to silence dissidents without any rule of law. Because as soon as the government gets the right to define, dissenters' speeches as hate speech, you can just lock them up. I mean, countries like like Russia and China and these authoritarian regimes love this sort of stuff. Now, not only that, but Islam, of course, in its current form, is completely incompatible with freedom of speech. Freedom of speech being the bedrock of Western civilization. So this is incompatible. And if you watch what's happened, especially in the last 20 plus years, there is an organization called the Islamic Conference, OIC, which has 57 Muslim country members who have done an extremely well done job of activism in marketing the idea that freedom of speech is an assault against Muslims' right to believe in Islam. And as a result of this activism, United Nations, the EU, Western societies have more and more gotten more hate speech laws. Criticizing religion has become forbidden in many places. So you're getting record arrestations and convictions of people for just stating their opinions. Of course, the mainstream media don't really write about this, but both culturally and socially, freedom of speech, the bedrock for psychological growth and development and a free society, has taken a massive hit in the last 20 years, and most people don't really know about it. I recently posted a post on Facebook. It was a TV debate between Tommy Robinson and a left-wing Danish journalist who was doing his best to smear him and to set him up. And Robinson tackled him well. Now, Robinson, as some of you know, exposed Muslim grooming gangs in Britain who molested thousands of young girls while the police and the media were busy looking away under fear of being labeled racists. He is the Voldemort of Facebook. Mention him and your post gets censored. So the video that I shared got censored due to Tommy Robinson being part of it. That guy is forbidden. A guy who criticizes Islam and stands up for Western values, freedom of speech, but people can promote Islam and, you know, radical feminism and social justice warrior ideologies all day, and that's fine. But remember this, if you're comfortable in letting, if you want the government to ban speech that you find offensive, it's only a matter of time until people who disagree with you politically get power. And now you suddenly become the one whose views are labeled hate speech, racist, bigoted, so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, if you don't grant freedom of speech to your enemies, you're taking away the foundation for your own freedom as well. If you can't view other people as autonomous beings with their own inner life, with the right to challenge, question, and express what's inside of them, you're taking away the basis for you to be able to do the same thing. That's the road to a totalitarian, authoritarian dictatorship. Sadly, it looks as if that's where we're heading. I think therapists collectively have to rally around freedom of speech. If you want a good book recommendation, if you really want to get into freedom of speech as a topic, my number one pick for you, it's an excellent book, is The Tyranny of Silence by Fleming Rose. He was the culture, what do you call it in Danish? Culture redaktør at Jyllandsposten, the place that published the cartoons that became part of the cartoon crisis back in 2006. An extremely well-written book. Read it. It'll probably scare the crap out of you, but you should have the information. Okay, till next time.